I'm Linda Coles, and this is Tell Us a Story. Hello and welcome to the show again. This week we're doing something a little bit different, so I'm not going to introduce my guest the same as I have everybody else, simply because I want Misty to tell her story. Safe to say, she's a beauty executive and a mother, and that's how she identifies herself to the world. So I'm not going to say any more, but hand you straight over to Misty Becker and let her tell the whole story. So welcome, Misty.
Thank you, Linda. January 2013, I woke up early in the month and learned some things pretty quickly that were very disturbing. I had lost my job of over 8 years with a very, very large office supply retailer. I discovered that my fiancé had been cheating on me for 3 years.
Ouch.
Painful, absolutely. He was also someone that I had dated in high school and had been in love with for a very, very long time. I was 37 years old, a single mom. I had no job, no relationship, and I had no idea what I was going to do with myself. I was raised by really great parents with some really incredible values. And I remember very clearly my mom saying to me, "It's all going to be fine," and me bursting into tears and saying, "I have no idea how." So I immediately went to work trying to market myself, to reinvent myself. In the States, there's really only one or two office supply players at the level that I was working at. I was a regional manager managing a large book of business, and it's really all I had ever done as a job. And this relationship that I had just ended, not by choice, was the only relationship I had had since my divorce. And so I really was at sixes and sevens trying to figure out who I was and what I was going to do. And while I was looking for a job, I went on a couple of really bad dates, and like horror story dates. And I had posted about it on Facebook, and a couple of friends of mine said, "You should write a book." And I said, "I have no time to write a book. I can barely get the laundry done and send out resumes and have a social life." I have 2 kids. My kids, I think at that time, were 10 and maybe 5 or 6. And I was super busy. Yeah. And I'm also a freelance musician, so I do some studio work on the side. And writing a book was out of the question. It was just too much. Yeah. And so it occurred to me that, oh my gosh, I'll start a blog. I had never written a blog before. I had never written more than a Yelp review about a restaurant in my whole life. So I'm this crazy woman who's like, I'm just going to write a blog. And I know nothing at this point about writing a blog or monetizing a blog. I hadn't even heard the term monetize a blog at that point. But I decided I needed an outlet for the pain of the cheating fiance and losing the job. And so I started a blog. And I would go on every other weekend. I didn't have my children at home. They were with their father. And I would go on a series of dates. So usually I was being set up by friends. I very rarely had to use online dating. And I would go on a date Friday night, Saturday morning, Saturday night, Sunday morning brunch. So, and sometimes Sunday dinner. So 4 or 5 dates in a weekend gave me a lot to write about.
I kept you busy.
It was so busy on the weekends, and it kept me from being sad, right? And talking with my girlfriends, they were having a horrible time dating in Los Angeles too. And we were starting to bring on content contributors, girlfriends of mine who were also going on horrible dates. And one day in March, so I started the blog end of January, beginning of February. One day in March, I woke up and I had 50,000 page views overnight.
Whoa.
And I had no idea how it happened because the only thing I was doing was sharing the links on Facebook.
You must have had some juicy stories on there.
Oh my gosh. I can tell you that one of the blogs was titled Cocaine Brunch Guy.
Oh, there we go.
So, and these were real things that were happening to me. I'd get to brunch with someone who seemed very respectable and lovely and had minded all of his P's and Q's up to our date. And then he'd end up leaving during the middle of brunch to go to the bathroom to use cocaine.
Oh, really?
Oh, it was horrible. It was just horrible. And
Yeah.
I started to find that I had regular readers who were sharing the content on Facebook and commenting on the blog. And we were creating this sort of community. And I had one reader in particular who was male, which was a shock to me because what man would care about my dating life? Um, and he would just berate me online constantly. Like, this is why you're always going to be single. Here's everything you did wrong on this date.
Oh,
And I know, right? And in my mind, I'm like, wait, the guy was using cocaine
yeah.
or had a foot fetish and didn't tell me until he tried to touch my feet. Like, how is that my fault? Um, but he always had this reason for whatever it was I did wrong. And he was very funny and very well written. And as it turned out, we had mutual friends.
Oh.
And he, one time in a blog, offered to save me from my next horrible date and gave me his phone number in a private message.
Mm.
And as it turned out, I was on a really horrible date about 2 weeks after that. And I called him because I was in the middle of a really awful date that I just didn't want to be on. And so he was talking to me as if I was a normal person. And on the other line, I'm saying, oh, yeah, that's horrible. I'll be right there. And he's like, you're on a date, aren't you? Yes, I am. Oh, my gosh. But I can go. I'll get there as soon as I can. Just stay where you are.
I
So
thought that only happened in movies.
no. Actually, my girlfriends and I had a total system set up where if I didn't respond to a text after a certain time, they would literally send in the cavalry. Luckily, I never had to use that option, but we had a girl code in place so that we could save each other.
Very wise.
And in this case, it was Daniel. And so it all would have gone to plan and it all would have worked out perfectly because I immediately told the horrible date, I have to go. I fibbed. My sister's sick. I have to go. Let's go home. I was driving. Everything would have gone off without a hitch, except then Daniel starts to call me over and over again. And you could see it on my Bluetooth, on my dash, in my car, that it's this person. And his picture keeps popping up on my phone. So my date obviously knew something was going on. I get home. I curl up in the fetal position after saying goodnight to my date. And I think, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm burned out. I'm not finding Mr. Right. It's been a few months at this point, and it's misery, right? I should grow up and just resign myself to being single with 20 cats drinking boxed wine for the rest of my life.
That sounds like bliss, actually.
Well, we'll get to that in a little bit because I kind of feel now that would be bliss. And I say it jokingly, but I really hope that I end up in an apartment by myself with hundreds of books, a lot of boxed wine, and my pets, because that would be amazing.
Yeah.
So I'm curled up in the fetal position in bed, telling myself that's my last bad date. And Daniel calls and basically says, put your clothes back on, stop being a whiny baby, let's go get a drink. In his way that he had about him to insult me and ask me out on a date at the same time. We'll get to more of that in a moment. So suffice it to say, I walk up to this bar, I see him. He's literally the most beautiful man I've ever met in my life. 6'3", beautiful blue eyes, just a chiseled jaw, wearing a shirt and a tie, just perfection. And I think to myself, oh Lord, I'm way out of my league. Here I am, this frumpy, tear-stained face, bag of misery, showing up to have my second horrible date of the night. And he turns out to be super hot.
Oh.
And then what proceeded from there was a series of incredible dates with Daniel. And we fell madly in love. And I'll say again that he's one of the most brilliant, amazing human beings I've ever met in my life. And just really felt like the yin to my yang in so many ways. And my readers, so at this point in the blog, by the way, I should also tell you this. I wake up one day and I have 160,000 subscribers. And I've not done anything to advertise this blog, and it's full of filthy language and horrible dates and just me cursing at the sky for being a single woman in Los Angeles. And I get to this point 5 months into writing this blog where I could monetize it at that point, and I fall in love with someone and I'm not dating any longer. So it seemed like it wasn't meant to be. And on the night of June 6th, so mind you, I started writing the blog in January. I meet Daniel. We're falling madly in love. On the night of June 6th, Daniel and I were supposed to meet and go to a barbecue together. And I texted him for several hours that night, having spoken with him last in the early afternoon. And I never heard back from him that night. And so I go home at 1 a.m. I went to the barbecue, and then I went out to karaoke afterwards, because I'll be damned if I was going to let a man stand me up and be miserable about it. Mm-hmm. But I really was miserable and heartsick about it. And I went to bed and I thought it was too good to be true. And the next morning at about 6 a.m., I get a call from Mary. And Mary is Daniel's mother. And I had met her once in passing about a month previously. And I'm sure she looked at me and she thought, it's just another girl in Daniel's life, and I'll never see her again. But later I find out that she watched her son and I fall in love and felt compelled to call me that morning to tell me that Daniel was in the ICU. And he was in intensive care because he had been assaulted and left to die in an alley the night before.
How did you react? What did you do?
I immediately woke up and drove to the hospital that he was at. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, Linda, I really thought, he's gotten himself into some scrape. It's going to be fine. Mm-hmm. And I had been berating him via text the night before. I can't believe you stood me up. How dare you do this to me? I thought you cared about me. And so in my mind, I'm thinking about all these horrible things I've said to this man that I've fallen in love with. And I'm horrified. But at that point, I'm not thinking that I'm going to walk into the ICU and see what I saw, which is a massive horseshoe-shaped incision in Daniel's skull and tubes in his brain, draining the swelling and the fluid around his brain. He had been left with a traumatic brain injury and was in a coma. Mm. And his mother hugs me tearfully, and immediately we get pulled into a room with a surgeon who had worked on the brain bleed for Daniel the night before. Mm-hmm. In the middle of the night. They found him sometime around 9 p.m. And once they figured out he had a brain bleed, it was close to midnight. And so they did surgery at that point. But the loss of oxygen to his brain had left him in a coma. Mm-hmm. And the surgeon said, at this point, he's young, he's in his 30s, he's healthy. We're hopeful that he'll wake up, but there are no guarantees.
Yeah.
Daniel was in a coma for several weeks.
Wow.
And then minimally conscious into August. So again, the brain injury took place June 6th, and he was either in a coma or minimally conscious until August. In July, he was moved to a rehabilitation facility where we were just waiting to see what would happen. And during that time, he caught pneumonia a couple of times. He had staph infections. Just everything was stacked against Daniel. He had had every hospital-borne illness you could have, including MRSA. And his body, he had lost 50 pounds, and at 6'3", looked like a skeleton. Stared into space every day. His eyes were open, but there literally was no one home. And about a week after my birthday in August, I was sitting next to his bed where I had been every day for months. My poor children, I'm mortified to say that I spent probably 50% of my time either in the hospital or in rehab. And I justified it by saying, my kids are healthy, they're well. They've been to the hospital to visit Daniel. They understand why I'm there. And so I was spending most of my time, my free time there. And
was Daniel in a coma at this stage still, or was he now out of a coma while you were spending so much time there? A bit of everything, I'm guessing.
Yeah, he was minimally conscious at this point in August, which meant his eyes were open and he would turn his head and move his limbs.
Right.
But there was no other response to stimuli at that point. And about a week after my birthday, I'm sitting next to his bed and I'm babbling to him the way that I do and did. And he starts moving his hands while looking at me. And I realize he's doing sign language. And I ask him, Daniel, when did you learn sign language? And in the States, every American child learns American Sign Language in elementary school between the ages of 7 and 9. And I asked Daniel, when did you learn sign language? And he signs to me 4th grade.
Wow.
And then I think the next thing that he signed to me was, who are you?
Oh.
And I couldn't breathe because I had spent months loving a man who had no idea who I was and was awake and able to communicate and thought I was a nurse. And also later told me, just as a funny aside, that he was completely creeped out that he thought I was a nurse and I was hugging him and kissing him. So, just as a funny aside, because he just thought I was part of the staff and had no recollection of our relationship for the 6 months prior to his injury.
That must have been hard for you.
I wanted to die. Not literally, but just I wanted it all to go away.
Yeah.
I had watched Mary lose her only child to a brain injury, and that was gut-wrenching and miserable. I watched a beautiful, intelligent, wonderful human being be reduced to learning how to eat. He couldn't swallow when he woke up. He would have choked to death. The atrophy on the left side of his body was so bad that he took months to learn how to stand on his own. It was almost a year, actually, that he was still in a wheelchair. So it had all been so intense and so much heartbreak for so long that it felt like insult to injury to have him have no idea who I was and not really be interested in anything to do with me other than signing me, when can I get out of bed? My body hurts. You know, those were just the basics that he would sign to me in sign language. Daniel...
Could he remember his mum at this stage, or was she a blank too?
No, he remembered his mother. They have the most remarkable relationship. Mary raised Daniel as a single mom, and they have such a close, beautiful bond that literally the first word he said when he was finally able to speak was mom. And he knew her the moment he saw her when he became fully awake. And it was such a beautiful, remarkable thing. And I, when he didn't remember me initially, I was terrified he wouldn't remember her and that she would just finally be broken from everything she had undergone. At this point, we believed we knew who had assaulted him, but the legal process was taking so long and no one had been arrested. She had just endured so much, and thank God he knew who she was, because that would have just been too much for her to bear.
Yeah. So did they ever find who did this to Daniel?
They did, and it was actually someone Daniel knew. And civil lawsuits still continue against this man. They were unable to prove, because of the lack of witnesses, that he was the person who caused the assault. So the criminal trial ended with a not guilty verdict. But the civil trial continues because of new information that's come out since the criminal trial. So I believe at some point there will be some justice for Daniel in that regard. But the man will never serve time for leaving another human being in this state. We didn't go to court until a year and a week after Daniel's injury. And during the time from August when Daniel started to wake up, because it took weeks really for him to become fully aware, he went home in October to live at home outside of rehab. He was in a walker. He had a feeding tube at that point still. So from October to June was still in a wheelchair, still had a feeding tube, and had to go to court in that state, and still really wasn't fully aware of what had happened to him. He had heard people talk about it, but his short-term memory is incredibly flawed from the brain injury. You could literally say, Daniel, we had physical therapy this morning, and 10 minutes later he'll say, I went to speech therapy today and I saw my speech therapist and these are the words that we talked about. So, you could tell Daniel you were assaulted in a parking lot and 10 minutes from now he won't remember that.
So if there's no one's ever been brought to justice, you have never found out a reason why such an attack happened?
No, we have no idea. Ultimately, we think that there was some sort of argument or altercation. I had to sit in court. Mary elected to sit outside of the courtroom. She couldn't bear to hear the person who caused the assault's take on what happened. But I sat in that courtroom that day and listened to other people who had been there that night talk about finding him. It appears that he hit his head on a cement parking block after being struck.
Right.
And that's what caused the injury. And he had a stranger give him CPR that night while they waited for an ambulance. And nobody will ever really understand what happened. What we do understand is that Daniel is forever changed. And what we also understand is that Daniel is incapable of an adult relationship. And so through all of this pain and heartache, I was trying to figure out as a human being and a grown woman how to relate to Daniel. And I couldn't walk away and leave his mother and him and his stepfather in a position where Daniel had gotten used to me being around, and I, in some small way, felt like some help to Mary, who was now taking care of her adult son for the rest of her life and his life. I had an incredible amount of guilt, but I knew that I could never have a physical relationship or a romantic relationship with Daniel again. And so I had a choice to make. Do I stay in this relationship? Because at that point he had been told over and over and over again that I was his girlfriend. And although sometimes he had to be reminded, the mind is tricky. It retains things strangely after a brain injury. So he might not know what he ate 10 minutes ago, but he had grown to learn that I was his girlfriend.
Yeah.
And then emotional attachment had happened during that year, right? You see someone every day, you become emotionally attached. And so I had this tremendous sense of guilt in July when I decided that it was incredibly unfair to expect an adult relationship from Daniel, who had no capacity for that. And emotionally, at 38 years old, I needed and wanted a companion for my life. Didn't want to be single forever, but also couldn't expect that from Daniel, and made the decision to end my romantic relationship with him.
And that would have been tough too. Tough to you to finally make that decision, I'm sure. You wouldn't have made that lightly.
Not at all. And during that time, Linda, the blog had grown, and people, instead of following my dating life, were so invested in Daniel's progress and bringing his assailant to justice. And it felt like I was letting the blog community that we had created down as well. For quite some time after Daniel's injury, I was updating our readers on a daily basis about his status and his healing and when he woke up. And, again, thousands of readers a night sometimes. And I felt an obligation to them as well, that they were rooting for us and they really wanted us to end up in a good place. And that just wasn't going to happen. And so I felt incredibly guilty
Yeah.
for so many reasons. And then guilt started to set in about not being a good mom. And I had to remove myself from the situation for a while, long enough to decompress. I had been living in a pressure cooker for so many months of my life, over a year at that point, and I had to learn how to live again.
Did you have someone to talk to this as you was going through all this? Because obviously Daniel wouldn't have been the person. Did you have a close confidant?
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I had Mary. We became just about as close as two people can become. His mother really embraced me and treated me as if I was family. And there was an intense trust between us because for a while we weren't revealing too many details about Daniel's injury while we tracked down the person who did this to him. And so I had Mary, but I couldn't talk to Mary about my romantic reservations about Daniel because it would cause this sort of intense anxiety with her.
Yeah.
You know, she really was hoping that her son would end up in a place where he could have a normal life. And so I also have a best friend who was a contributor on the blog during the dating season of the blog. And she really was my shoulder to cry on. And she watched all of this happen very close up. And I think she was waiting for me to get to the point where I could say, I can't do this anymore. It's wrong to be in a romantic relationship with Daniel. And I have to heal myself before I can ever be in a relationship with anyone ever again. Because I was pretty broken at this point. Yeah, I didn't have a lot of faith in our justice system. I didn't have a lot of faith in this stupid thing people called love. And I felt like, you know, bad things happen to really good people and life was really unfair. And I was really unreasonable and irrational.
Yeah.
I was one of those shrieking women who were mad at everybody at that point. And during that time, the most remarkable thing is that by running the blog, I learned how to market myself into being a completely new person. And I'll explain that by saying I rebranded myself. So instead of being this manager of an office supply sales team, I ended up as a VP of sales for a beauty company. Completely jumped industries. And I was doing it all while spending 50% of my time in a hospital. And I learned that you can change everything if you put your mind to it.
Yeah.
You really have every ounce of power in the universe to change your life, even in the worst of circumstances. And I also learned that it's possible to juggle everything. And if you place the right emphasis in the right places, you can get it all done as a single mom and a mother and a friend and a romantic partner. You just need to make sure that you're balancing things appropriately. And that's the point where I said, oh my gosh, I've been a horrible mom. I haven't really been the best employee either because I've spent a lot of time out of the office having to care for Daniel. And okay, so I can't be in this romantic relationship with Daniel, but you've learned marketing from your blog and you've learned how to sell yourself and you've learned how to sell a story in a really unique and interesting way, and you can capitalize on that. And so I changed everything about my life. I got out of debt. I had been in debt from a really nasty divorce years and years before, and I got out of debt. I got the job I wanted. I have an incredible relationship with my kids. I actually changed jobs this year so that I could spend more time with my son who's in marching band and goes to marching band competitions on the weekend, and my daughter who's started playing instruments as well, because I rebalanced my life after a year of living in a pressure cooker.
And you've taken time for yourself, though, it sounds, as well, to sort yourself out and get back to the Misty that you were before in, you know, the loving, caring woman with a family and energy and interests and everything that goes with that before everything hit rock bottom for you.
Yeah. And, you know, the biggest contributor to that was spending time really alone, reflecting. I had to do that for period of about 90 days, I sort of went into hiding. I didn't socialize at all. I wasn't making music with friends the way I had been. And I really just needed to breathe through my pain.
Yeah.
And understand really why I was in pain. Was I in pain because I lost a relationship? Or what I really learned about myself was that I was in pain because I watched and witnessed and was part of probably the most painful thing I'll ever witness for another human being to go through.
Yeah.
And that's really what was hurting me. I've completely grown out of that need to get married and find a man and make my life work that way. And I've also learned that in my career, my story is what people are looking for. When I'm selling to customers or when I'm marketing our brands, the beauty business is incredibly competitive. And what I learned by writing that blog, where my biggest view counts came from titles that I thought were awful, but came from the most authentic titles I could write, like, I had a horrible date last night. People weren't interested in something flashy or shiny. They were interested in substance and reality and understanding me at a very human level. And I've taken that with me into my career, where instead of being this polished executive, I strive every day to be a real human being.
That's nice.
And so I live by this sort of code now that authenticity is where I want to be all the time, and that really authentic space where I've learned to be vulnerable.
Do you feel that you speak your mind more now, or not really?
So I used to be pretty meek about that, I will say that. But I think after living through all of that, it's sort of given me a purpose to not shrink.
Yeah.
In times of pain or in times of difficulty. And so I have become more assertive. I would never settle for a horrible date with cocaine brunch guy anymore. I would never take a phone call back from that guy at this point in my life. And in fact, I have no plans, nor do I want to get married anytime soon, where that felt like my whole purpose when I started the blog. So I feel empowered. It was a horrible way to become empowered, but I really do feel like I've taken myself back. I will say that Daniel and I are still friends to this day. He lives nearby. I stop by and see his mom and Daniel whenever I can. I feel like it's important that we all went through this thing, Daniel more than anyone else, but we all went through this period of time together where it's important that we stay connected so that we have that common touchstone where we can all sometimes sit together and go, that happened to us and we're okay. And it's not how we would have ever chosen it, but we're okay.
Good. So you're obviously you haven't got the need in your life now for want of a better word, a man. You're going to live your life. You figure that you can live your life how you want, and it doesn't include anybody or anything of the conventional setup, I suppose, that you don't have to have a partner. Is that really how you're thinking now?
Yes, and I would say that the one thing that I would say to anyone who's going through something tough or having difficulty is that it is okay to walk away from the things that no longer serve you.
Yeah.
You don't have to feel married to an idea or a situation. You don't have to feel married to a job because that's what you've always done. It's okay to walk away from the things that don't serve you any longer, and you're going to be okay. And that's what I've learned and where I am in my life now.
Well, I'm glad that it's all worked out for you in the end, Misty. It was a horrible experience to have gone through. I can only imagine that something like that's taken so long as well, and to this day isn't finished, really, is it, with the civil case, etc.
Right. I mean, he will have to have 24-hour care for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
His mom will have to hire caregivers or be his caregiver forever, and they will always need support. So with the civil case and with his situation, a 40-year-old man who can't take care of himself. It's never going to end.
No.
And that's probably the saddest and most painful thing that I take away from it now, is that this is forever for them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a remarkable story, Misty. What would your one piece of advice be about anything, whether it's anything to do with this whole experience, something you've learned from this experience, or just something that's always stood by you for all of your life? What would that one piece of advice be?
I can live through literally anything, and so can anyone else. Short of someone, causing grave bodily injury to you that you can't survive, you can live through any situation, any amount of pain. It can all be okay, and it's all in how you handle it. I've watched Daniel go from being an unconscious human being, a shell of a man, really, to having really a vibrant social life. And he has joined a traumatic brain injury group, and he goes on a regular basis and has made new friends. And his life will never be the same, but he's as healthy and happy as he can be. And if he can do that, we all can do that.
Yeah. And the thing that I've just been thinking as we've been chatting here, it's easy to send a text and go on the negative rather than the worry. And I'm not suggesting people immediately start worrying when somebody's not replied to their text, but the last words that I say to my hubby when he leaves the door in the morning is always a kiss on the cheek, even if he's in a rush to get away from me.
Right.
I try never to say goodbye, and just something sweet, and never go to bed, or never go to sleep on a bad word. And I'm going to carry on with that now. And the whole text thing, I can see that would be something that would stick with me. And I say that not to make you feel guilty. That is not my intention. I hope that's not the way that listeners are going to take it. I'm just thinking of the things that happen in my life, those little important things that I will never send a nasty text to anybody.
You're so right. And I'm still, I think to myself, I'm still mortified by those text messages I sent him, and am glad all the time that he was never able to see his phone again. They used it in the case, and never read those words from me. So you are absolutely right. Don't go to bed angry, and don't send angry text messages, because they will haunt you.
Yeah. And I don't mean to be glib. That's just what I'm taking out of my own personal, listening to your very personal experience. Well, where are you up to now in closing? What's going really cool for you? What's really right for you?
Well, I have the most amazing children who have completely forgiven me for being gone for a year of their life dealing with Daniel, who are straight A students, who are just beautiful human beings. Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways, what happened to Daniel, they lived through it too and saw his story unfolding in front of them. And although I'm sad that they had to live through that, I really do feel like it's made them better humans in some ways.
I can imagine.
They're so patient and understanding about people with disabilities, which is a beautiful thing. I have an incredible job. I play with beauty products all day for a living. How bad could that be?
No, great.
And I have amazing friends who loved me through the worst moments of my life. And you can't pay for that. That's just a gift, right?
Yeah. Well, that's lovely. And thank you very much for coming on and sharing your story, Misty. There's some lessons there. Well, there's a lot of lessons there, a lot of life lessons. And I'm glad that you found happiness and that everything's working out for you, and that Daniel's on his own journey and road to recovery. So thanks again, Misty.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Tell Us a Story. Why not subscribe or rate us next time you're on iTunes?